Hi, Eran. How are you?
Fine, holding up.
Good, good. So today I'm with Eran Lerman in Modi'in in central Israel. Eran is an expert on national security issues. Between 2009 and 2015, he was Israel's Deputy National Security Advisor in the governments of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I might add that 6 years is a long time to hold this kind of position, and Eran worked both under Netanyahu's first national security advisor, Uzi Arad, who was previously director of intelligence was previously director of intelligence for the Mossad, and then when Netanyahu replaced Uzi Arad with Yaakov Amidror, Eran, who had previously served under Amidror in military intelligence, stayed on in his position in the Israeli Prime Minister's office for several more years. And indeed, had Eran chosen not to retire, we would probably be doing this Zoom conversation now with Eran at a hotel room in Abu Dhabi, given the landmark agreement between Israel and the UAE this week. Eran and I have been friends for almost 20 years, and we meet from time to time to informally discuss foreign affairs and strategic matters. So, Eran, before we talk about the UAE-Israel deal, and other international matters, let's just briefly talk about your upbringing. Why don't you just tell us briefly about your family background and your childhood?
And I sometimes joke with my American friends that I haven't met many people nowadays in the States whose parents fought in the War of Independence. Well, that was more than 2 centuries ago, but my parents did. My mother was a wireless operator in Jerusalem under siege. My father was the commander of the small reserve force in the Jewish quarter, which was under siege, and then he was a POW in Jordan for 9 months, my late father. And at one point, by the way, I had an opportunity to thank King Abdullah II personally for the decent treatment that was meted out to the Israeli prisoners in that war, because my father came back safe, sound, and then when peace was made with Jordan, he took my mother for a tour of Jordan, and then I followed on other business and had an opportunity to meet the king and thank him. So that's my background. My roots are here. And my British accent should not mislead you. It's acquired. And I went to a good school in Haifa, and something happened in 1973 that turned my life in a certain direction.
Yes.
I'm afraid. Sorry about this.
That's okay.
Hello? אני בשיחת זום, בבקשה אל תתקשרי, ביי.
Don't worry. Let me just remind people watching this, in case they don't know, that the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, which was of course Jewish, was captured by Jordan in the War of Independence for Israel in 1948, which is why Iran's father was a prisoner of war with Jordanians. Anyway, we were mentioning 1973, and for anyone who doesn't know, 1973 was a major war, in fact the last major war for Israel in a way, which was the Yom Kippur War, and Israel was hit although Israel won that war, it was still suffered very significant losses and so on. So Eran, as I know from previous conversations, you were still at high school, I think you were 17, and that's when you sort of got very awakened to the importance of intelligence and national security issues. Is that right?
Yeah, I was doing math and physics and chemistry and stuff, and it occurred to me that the intelligence failure to predict the surprise attack by Egypt and Syria in the 6th of October on Yom Kippur, on the day of Yom Kippur in 73, signaled the major failure of our intelligence services. And I sort of said to myself, I think I should see what I can do personally and to become an intelligence operator, an intelligence officer. Maybe, I can be of help when the next challenge comes up the road. And so I went back to my Arabic, picked up enough to qualify, and ended up serving as an intelligence operator and officer and senior officer on and off with a PhD at LSE in the middle from 1975 when I was drafted until I left the service in 2000.
So, we know that you were like about 20 years in military intelligence. You've also served in a political role, as you mentioned, as the Deputy National Security Advisor. So let's talk about a few of the issues today that Israel and the region faces. Let's just start, because it's most current, with, as people know, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which is one of the most significant Arab countries, are in the process of signing a peace accord. And this is the third Arab country after Egypt and Jordan. Sorry?
People tend to forget Mauritania, but it collapsed since then because of a political change there. But for a while, we had an embassy in Nouakchott.
Okay, so I stand corrected. So anyway, this is the first one, as far as I'm aware, since the Jordan-Israel treaty 25 years ago. How significant is this rapprochement? Of course, we all know that it didn't come overnight, that lots of contacts have been ongoing with Israel and the UAE and other Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, for a long time. And even I have been present at various meetings where officials from Israel and officials from Saudi Arabia and other countries have been present. So it's not a new thing, but it's new to be so public and so warm and so open. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's very significant in three levels. First of all, the UAE is by far the most advanced, the most eager to modernize, the most proactive player in the Arab world today. And the fit with Israel is perfect. In terms of what we have to offer technologically, in terms of ideas of innovation, what they have to offer, their attitudes, their agenda domestically at home, in terms of their economy, in terms of their concept of what their future might be. It's a very good fit. And this is the first time we are signing an open agreement with a country with huge resources. I mean, we are talking about a country which has about $1 million in sovereign funds per citizen, well over $1 trillion for the 1.3 million citizens. There are 10 million residents in the UAE, but only just about over 10% of them are actual citizens of the country. So you're talking about an immensely rich country with a very diversified economy that long ago took off from its energy base. And so that's very important. The second thing is, it is I would say, a milestone in the effort, in the ongoing effort, to persuade our Palestinian cousins and neighbors that their fantasy about an imposed solution, that somehow the Arab world will drag the rest of the world into imposing a solution on Israel, is basically a fantasy. With all due respect to people like Saib Erekat and others who've been selling this fantasy to Mahmoud Abbas now for years, locking him into a set of expectations that he thinks is enshrined in UN resolutions like UN Security Council Resolution 2334, but they run against the actual interpretation, proper interpretation of UN Security Council Resolution 242. And in any case, they run against the sentiments and the security interests of Israel, and the great majority of Israelis understand this. So we need to come to the table on the basis of the two-state solution, but a two-state solution which is not a Palestinian imposition through international coercion. And when the UAE signals that they would, first of all, go for normal relations with Israel, and then try to facilitate help in trying to facilitate a negotiation, maybe based on at least the principles, the concepts that underlie the Trump concept, the Trump plan, peace to prosperity, whatever you want to call it. When this happens, it's a very important message. And it may actually bring better results than the absolute stalemate that we saw during years and years of Palestinian expectation that somehow the world will deliver on what I call the EKP, the everybody knows paradigm, the assumption that everybody knows what Israel would be required to concede. The only problem is the Israeli public doesn't accept it. The politics of Israel will not carry that weight. So,
might I add? Sorry. Might I just add on a more general point that usually in history, the losers don't get to impose the terms of the peace. And the Palestinians have lost repeated wars with Israel, and yet certain people in the international community think that the Palestinians can impose the terms of the peace. In fact, throughout history and throughout the 20th century, there were many border adjustments and so on, and the Palestinians could have had a state on numerous occasions, and they could have a state now under the Trump plan, but they can't, it's not advisable for them, as you say, to fantasize that they can determine without making concessions how that state will be exactly. So
I can tell you, I was with Netanyahu during the Kerry initiative. There was, by the way, a pretty good piece about this also by Mike Herzl, who was also there from advising the prime minister during the negotiations. And Netanyahu was willing to take political risks and make painful decisions. He said as much in public.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind people, we're talking about John Kerry, Secretary of State under Barack Obama, and a lot of people don't know that it wasn't just Ehud Barak, the Israeli Labour Prime Minister under Clinton, who offered the Palestinians a state. It wasn't just Ehud Olmert, the centrist Kadima Prime Minister under George W. Bush presidency, who offered the Palestinians a state. But Netanyahu under the Obama presidency with John Kerry was also negotiating some kind of a settlement to this issue. That's what you're referring to. So sorry to go on.
Yeah, based on what he said already during the first Obama term of office, in the Bar Ilan speech, he spoke about the Palestinian state, and then he negotiated with Kerry in 2013, 2014 on that basis. But Saeb Erekat was advising Abbas to abandon the table because of a couple of reasons. One was that it would require a compromise, and the second was that the Americans openly expected the Palestinians to recognize Israel as the embodiment of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, something that Abbas was not willing to do or was advised not to do. And then they abandoned the table. They did not even bother to answer Obama when Abbas met him in March 2014 and said, I'll give you an answer, and never, ever came back. So all of this was somehow based on the assumption that they can get a much better deal, something which will impose conditions on Israel, because the Arab world will pressure the rest of the world and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't know about losers or winners. I'm not a triumphalist. There are some Israelis who are, I'm not. But I definitely think that the Palestinians missed out on an opportunity to negotiate with a prime minister who could certainly deliver even painful concessions.
And might I add, right now, that Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, is a right-wing or center-right Prime Minister under Likud, and you have President Trump, who's a Republican, therefore more nationalistic American president. they have offered to remind people under the Trump plan, again, the Palestinians a state with border adjustments, but with $50 billion, which is a lot of investment. And even now, the Palestinians are refusing to negotiate. And I think what we're saying is, as the UAE and indeed other Arab countries are likely to follow,
and Bahrain, which hosted the workshop last year,
Oman and others, as they make their own agreements with Israel, this is maybe the only way the Palestinian leadership will climb down from the tree and be more realistic and see what's realistically achievable in order to establish an independent Palestinian state that doesn't threaten Israel. Because I want just to come to the next question, which is about the so-called Jordan Valley. It's often portrayed in the media internationally as a kind of only the Israeli settlers or the right wing want to keep control of that. But of course, I believe it's consensus not just in Israel, but indeed quietly, Jordan and other Arab states also want Israel to stay in security control of the Jordan Valley. Is that right?
Well, let me connect this with the UAE business. The third aspect of the UAE deal, which also relates to Israel's role in the region, is that it consolidates what I call the camp of stability. Ever since the region went in pieces in the so-called, tragically ironic name, the Arab Spring, which became more like an earthquake than, the birds and the bees and the flowers.
Winter storm, let's call it.
Back 10 years ago, it went to pieces. And among these pieces, what you find now, leaving aside the liberals who could not take power and the old socialist nationalists who were destroyed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you now have are Islamists in various hues and colors, IS, Islamic State, Daesh, and other jihadi Salafists tried to take power but defeated on the ground. You have an Islamist-oriented government in Ankara, which leads a group of Islamist forces like Hamas, like the government in Western Libya, the GNA government in Libya, or part of Libya, like the Muslim Brotherhood under the surface in a number of countries, and in alliance with the Qataris in the Gulf, who take a different position than the rest of the Gulf. This is the camp of Erdogan. And then you have the Iranian camp of destabilizers. In Beirut, Hezbollah, we saw consequences. The relationship with Syria, the relationship with parts of the militias in Iraq, and the Houthi uprising in Yemen, and so forth, another camp of destabilizers. Jordan, on the other hand, like Egypt, like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, and if I extend this into the Mediterranean, I would include also Greece and Cyprus, also, and now France, being on the side of the forces of stability. Jordan is a vital element, a vital link in keeping the region stable despite the ambitions of these people. For Jordan to be stable, it needs the IDF, the Israeli military capacity, to rest right up to the river on our side of it, on the western side of it. Because if something goes wrong in Jordan, if somebody tries to destabilize Jordan, we can react. If somebody tries to use Jordan as a springboard for penetration into the West Bank, into Judea and Samaria, as some Israelis call it, the result would be that they would be stopped at the waterline. Very thin waterline, mind you. The Jordan is not the Amazonas, but you stop them dead on that line. So there's no point in trying to destabilize Jordan. So our presence in the Jordan Valley is actually important for the Palestinians themselves, so they cannot get exploited by Iranians and Hamas and other ambitious destabilizers. It's important for Jordan, it's important for us, it's important for the entire region. And this is something that even our saint of peace who gave his life for the peace effort, Yitzhak Rabin, recognized and said very clearly in his last speech to the Knesset in October 95, a few weeks before he was assassinated, said loud and clear, Israel's security border must be on the Jordan River.
Yes. So let's just to sum up there, if the Jordan Valley is, if Israel doesn't have control, other malign forces, including ISIS, Iran, and others, are likely to occupy that and destabilize not only Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but also Jordan and other countries in the region. So, Eran, I know that you've spent a lot of time and an expert also on the East Mediterranean. This is often not in the news so much, but the close relations between Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and of course what's going on in Libya, which isn't reported that much, but it's very important to the security of Europe, with both Russian and Turkish and other military commanders now in Libya. Tell us a bit about how you see the East Mediterranean and what's happening there.
Well, ironically, by the way, the Russians are more on our side on this particular case. It goes back to Turkey's decision to intervene militarily in Libya in late 2019, in response, among other things, to the creation of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which brings together France and Italy, Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Cyprus, and even and Greece, and even the Palestinian Authority. It's an attempt to generate cooperation on energy matters, but also on strategic matters between the stabilizing elements in the region. Turkey is trying to overthrow the existing order. It is grumbling about the Lausanne agreements with the Greeks in the 1920s. It is trying to redraw the lines between the exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean in ways which would block up Israel, Cyprus, and Egypt, cut our access to Greece and Italy and Europe generally, by imagining a Turkish-Libyan border, which, by the way, contradicts the existing law of the sea as we know it, and Turkey never signed the UN CLOS. So basically, we're looking at Erdogan for domestic reasons, as well as because of Islamist motivations and nationalist motivations, challenging the existing order in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the forces of Israel, Egypt, Greece, France, and the UAE, by the way, and that's connected to the UAE initiative. UAE is very firmly in support of the Egyptian regime against Turkish subversion. So all of this adds to a great drama, now enacted by naval maneuvers, not yet coming to blows, I should hope not, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and fighting by proxy in Libya between Turkey's proxies and to some extent Turkish troops in the west or northwest of Libya, and pro-Egyptian forces, the Libyan National Army of Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, if I may say so, probably not the greatest military genius in North Africa since Scipio Africanus, but nevertheless, the man who the Egyptians and others are supporting in order to curb Turkish ambitions, Turkish hegemonist ambitions in the Mediterranean. So we have a clash of wills, we have a clash on the ground, we have naval maneuvers. Israel has come down firmly and clearly in support of the Greek-Egyptian map, which is the alternative to the Turkish-Libyan map. And by the way, on the same, practically immediately, so did the UAE. So you can see the connection between the Israeli-UAE breakthrough and events in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Just very interesting. Just finally, a couple of quick questions. You worked under Netanyahu, as I said, for a number of years. He seems to have been quite very capable, in fact, on foreign affairs, and has greatly increased Israel's ties, not just with, you know, India, China, Russia, but also, of course, with Donald Trump, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sunni Arab world, and in Latin America. So the question is, do you think Netanyahu, I mean, he's been very skilled in foreign affairs, I would say, and also avoiding getting Israel dragged into the Syrian war in any too significant a way. So do you think a future prime minister after Netanyahu will be able to continue this, or is it Netanyahu himself who has had this skill set to really raise Israel's profile internationally? And the second and final question, just quickly, do you think the Saudis, who of course have unofficial ties with Israel, will they be the last of the Gulf Arabs to officially bring their relationship with Israel into the open, or could we see it sooner than we think?
Well, Netanyahu is a very talented individual, and I think what makes him acutely aware of the importance of our foreign relations is his grounding in economics. He was a very successful Minister of Finance. He is definitely, I would think, definitely deserves much of the credit for Israel's remarkable transformation into an powerful exporting country with a remarkably powerful, strong currency. I mean, even uncomfortably strong currency right now for our exporters, with the dollar plunging against the shekel. And he understands that our relations with the Gulf have something to do with it, because when the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Japanese and sub-Saharan African countries, etc., and Europeans, of course, realize that there is no cost in terms of their Arab relationships, the key Arab relationship with the powerful economies of the Gulf, to their relationship with Israel, because Israel and the Gulf countries now stand, as they say in good Arabic, fi nafs al-khandak, in the same trench against common enemies. When this is the situation, then Israel can thrive in its relations with much of the rest of the world. So this is Netanyahu's legacy. I can only assume that since it is built on the foundations of a clear-headed realization of what the interests of a country like Israel, which thrives on exports, require, I think whoever takes over down the road will look at things much the same way. On the Saudis, I would say they'll take a comfortable position in the middle. They will not be the second after the UAE, but they will certainly not be the last. The Kuwaitis are very fearful because of where they live and because of all kinds of historical associations with Arab nationalism. So the Kuwaitis have been rather nasty about the UAE breakthrough. And of course, Qatar is on the other side. It's with the Turks. And unless there's a dramatic shift in Qatari attitudes, Qatar will certainly be the last. So Saudi Arabia and Oman will come somewhere in the middle. Bahrain, the more likely candidate to be second in the Gulf is probably Bahrain, which had already hosted the Trump plan workshop last year and has very close relations with the UAE, and at the end of the also has a traditional Jewish community. Their lady ambassador to the United States from the family Nunu was Jewish, and so Bahrainis, I wouldn't be surprised if they would be the second, placing Oman and Saudi Arabia somewhere next down the road.
So anyway, Eran, I think we're out of time, but that's been very interesting, and we'll hopefully meet again fairly soon. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.